federal law doesn't regulate work hours for 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds. These are people who are still in school. So that is an area where state standards have been so important and so fundamental.
We wanted to kind of switch gears and talk about the state policies. And I know you could give us some examples of like states that are doing better in terms of supporting organizing, and of course, the states like Florida that are making it harder. But the one issue that is just continuing to come up in Alabama and elsewhere, in Iowa as well, is child labor. And so we wanted to mention child labor because we have this group in Alabama called the Alabama Policy Institute that receives, Koch brother money. And they are now pushing legislation to remove barriers for minors to go to work. And Jacob, you can chime in more with some of the details of this, but we wanted to talk about the child labor trends because that is something, that just boggles my mind that in 2024, our labor movement is having to fight back against child labor. But, you study state policy and you see what's happening across the country. I assume that, Alabama's not alone in these proposals to loosen child labor laws, right?
Yeah, and thank you for telling me about Alabama Policy Institute because I'll have to look that one up. But
They're
definitely
bad.
not alone.
They're real bad.
Okay. So we have been tracking state attacks on child labor laws for the last year now. And Alabama is not alone in that regard. So we've got over 22 states, I believe, at this point, where we've seen proposals just in the last 2 to 3 years to weaken child labor laws at the state level. So this is a very coordinated, multi-industry push across the country with sometimes very clearly stated long-range goal of rolling back federal standards eventually for the whole country. So, this is sort of some of the same industry groups that ever since the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act was passed, that's the law that put in place minimum wage, overtime, and child labor protections for the first time in our history, has had a goal of, wiping out those standards. So those groups that are pushing the measures at the rollbacks at the state level often include state chapters of the National Restaurant Association, state chambers of commerce, National Federation of Independent Business, their state chapters. But then there's also, a lot of influence from some billionaire-backed sort of dark money groups. There's a think tank called Foundation for Government Accountability that is Florida-based, but that has been very instrumental in writing many of the child labor bills that have been introduced in states the last few years and coordinating their passage in state legislatures where they have a lot of influence, along with sort of the more familiar Koch-backed groups like Americans for Prosperity and others.
Right.
Well, I was just going to jump in and say that the range of these proposals have kind of varied. There's been some, just really extreme stuff. There was one recently, having difficulty remembering the state, but that proposed to allow children to work 8 hours on a school night and 40 hours in a school week. And it's that's kind of bizarre. There have been some to even allow 14-year-olds in the coal mines, and it's amazing that there's even anybody willing to put their names to something like that. It's a little bit less extreme what the Alabama Policy Institute is proposing here in Alabama, but it's still pretty extreme. What they want to do is they want to remove the requirement for schools to sign off on 14 and 15-year-olds being able to work. Right now in Alabama, there's a requirement for schools to say, like, yay, verily, this 14-year-old is doing good in school, and so, we sign off on them having, a small little part-time job or whatever. And so they're couching it in this language of, like, parents' rights, and parents should be able to determine, not the state, how good their kid is doing in school. And it's like, I don't know. It's pretty kind of objective measurements, you can see, you can just see if the kid is doing well in school. Are they making A's and B's, or are they making, C's and D's and F's, right? If they're the latter, then they probably shouldn't be working after school. They should probably be studying. And I'm interested in if you have found any tension in the among the conservative bloc while this is being pushed, because I think the obvious thing is that the beneficiary of all of these new loosening of child labor laws are going to be like poultry plants utilizing undocumented children to undercut, the wages of immigrant, documented immigrant, and then, native born kind of American wages in like poultry plants and stuff, or the farms, or, things like this. It's not, we're not looking at WASPs, going and working in the fields because of this legislation. Is there any at all recognition of the tension there between the anti-immigrant rhetoric coming from the right and then also this almost explicit permission to exploit immigrants?
Yeah, I mean, I think the starting point for this discussion that we sometimes skip over is that we've never eradicated exploitative forms of child labor in the U.S., despite maybe what lots of us would like to think. We have hundreds of thousands of children working in our agricultural sector, in some cases completely legally, because we have a double standard in our federal and most state labor laws that allows children, in some cases as young as 10 or 12, to work in highly hazardous agricultural occupations. And even though our child labor laws have been very important and effective to some extent at doing what we developed a consensus about 100 years ago that we wanted to do as a country, which is try to ensure some measure of equal opportunity and equal access to public education for most children, those laws are uneven across the country, and they have never been updated since 1938 at the federal level. So, when you mention that it sounds kind of shocking that there are some states that now are changing what had been pretty long-standing kind of guardrails around how many hours per week should a student who's still in high school be working, or how late into the night, can you assign a 16-year-old to work an overnight shift? Well, the reality, when you start looking into what our state law landscape is that actually there are states all over the country that never set those guardrails. And so part of what we're seeing in terms of this national coordinated effort to wipe out a lot of existing child labor standards is that they've done a really careful analysis, frankly. I hand it to them. They've done a really careful analysis of which states have filled some of the gaps that are in our federal law. So if Alabama's got a work permit system, they're going after that work permit system and trying to eradicate it because they know that's one of the things that's not covered in federal law. So the attacks look different in every state because the industry groups that are trying to roll back the standards are trying to clear the decks and sort of wipe out anything that states have done proactively to go above and beyond the very weak floor that our federal law sets for protecting children and making sure that they can get access to a good education, regardless of what their economic background is, or regardless of their immigration status. Right. And that is really terrifying. And I do see the attacks as very much intertwined with ongoing persistent attacks on our public education system more broadly. So this is, this campaign to wipe out child labor standards is very much coming from the same groups that do not believe in public education because they believe in maintaining economic inequality and maintaining an underclass of impoverished families who are easy to exploit and who are desperate enough to have to accept low-wage work and under hazardous conditions.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
So that is the same groups that are, I mentioned that Florida, Foundation for Government Accountability Group. Their sort of priority package of policy proposals is rolling back child labor standards, but also what they're really pushing in a lot of states is things like restricting access to food benefits and SNAP, making it harder for people to get Medicaid, to have health care if you're a poor family, right? So it's this very toxic combination of increasing the economic desperation of our poorest families while legalizing unscrupulous exploitative behavior of employers who are willing to sort of recruit and hire kids for long hours, low wages, and exploitative conditions. We've had, if folks haven't seen them, I highly recommend looking at the journalism that Hannah Dreier has done at the New York Times in the past year to really humanize the conditions that we have young children working in all over the country.
Do you think that because there are some that are doing, like you said, like trying to trim away the extra guardrails that states have set up above and beyond federal laws, and what we're talking about in Alabama is that. But then the one that I talked about earlier is actually explicitly going below the federal floor, because it is not federally legal for children to work 30 or 40 hours in a work week. That is illegal under federal law. Do you think that there's in parallel with this move to trim away some of the additional guardrails, do you think there's a move to directly challenge the constitutionality of the Federal Labor Standards Act as such?
There, among some groups, there is both. Yes, absolutely. And there have definitely been state legislators who have openly said, I'm aware that what I'm proposing here is in contradiction to current federal law on a certain standard. And I'm happy about that because I think it'll call it to their attention, and Congress should also lower their standard, standard too. Some of them are saying that very explicitly. We had a representative in Indiana at a hearing just this week, basically said that outright. Right. But I hate being the person to have to break this news to folks again and again this past year, but the reality is actually our federal law above for employers who hire anyone over the age of 15 and above, our federal law doesn't regulate hours, doesn't regulate work hours for 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds. These high school students, right? These are people who are still in school. And so that is another area where state standards have been so important and so fundamental. And frankly, states historically were often the leaders and the innovators. A lot of states had standards on factory work and mining and work in tobacco fields and many other things prior to the Fair Labor Standards Act because, there was concern among policymakers at the state level who could see what was happening to children in these industries long before we had the Fair Labor Standards Act. So, believe it or not, there is no guardrail coming from our federal law because it's never been updated since 1938. Even, 1938 was a time when the vast majority of people in our country did not complete high school in the working class, right? We live in a different country now, in a different economy. Right. We've made incredible strides on opening up educational access, and we live in an economy where we know that young people who lack a high school credential or some other sort of credential will suffer lifelong consequences often because it limits their economic opportunity and suppresses their earnings for a lifetime, right? So if folks are trying to roll back state standards to push younger people into low-wage work for longer hours while they're still in high school, putting them at risk for not completing education and not having that credential, it's really turning back the clock. Because it's been amazing to me, this is not an area of research I had delved into until recently, but it's amazing to me to see the kind of strides that a lot of states have made on high school completion rates just in the last 20 or 30 years, right? So that's the kind of, that's actually progress. And so when we see that fewer 16-year-olds, for example, are in the labor force than they were in 1970 or 1980, that's actually a good thing.
Right.
They're not in the labor force because they're in school. And what that means is it's setting them up for a better career, a better lifelong income, a better set of opportunities for their family in the future. And so, when we've got state representatives in these hearings on child labor laws around the country often saying, oh, we're really, bummed out that 30 years ago, we had a higher labor force participation rate among teens. My jaw is just dropping. How is that a goal that we're pursuing in the 21st century? It is totally being driven by a set of low-wage industries that want to increase their access to immediate access to low-wage labor. That is all this is.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Jennifer, I know we got to let you go, but I just want to thank you for your time and thank you for your work and your research. And I just want to point people to epi.org. That's where you can find out more about the Economic Policy Institute. There's a lot of great information there. On policy, on the connection between labor unions and democracy. There's a great report about the South and our failed economic model called Rooted in Racism that I highly recommend. I know it came out not too long ago. So Jennifer, thanks again for joining us this morning. Keep up the good work and appreciate you.
Yeah, take care. Great to talk to you.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project. And you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.